Okay, let's talk about osmosis and iced tea. Okay, so here's a glass of iced tea. It's got 6 cubes in it. Here's another glass of iced tea. It has 2 ice cubes in it. Okay, so which glass has more tea in it? Glass A or glass B? Which glass has more tea? That's right, glass B does. Less ice means that there's more room for fluid, for the tea. And that's all osmosis questions are. They're all about trying to determine where the fluid is at a greater level and where it will go. That's it. Let's try some now. If a plant cell is in a hypotonic solution, what will happen? Well, let's say a normal plant cell is 30% particles, just like our glass of iced tea. 30% particles, that means 70% of it is fluid. Okay, so let's look at this beaker right here that is 10% particles or solute, and therefore 90% of it is fluid. Well, like I said, the first thing you ask yourself is which one has more fluid? Because we know that fluid will flow downhill, always downhill. So the beaker has 90% and the plant cell has 70%. All right, so what's going to happen if we put that plant cell into the beaker? Well, the fluid will flow in one direction, and that flowing is from what to what? What do you think? How will the fluid flow? Well, downhill would be flowing from fluid flows, fluid flows, fluid moves from high to low. The solution, right, the beaker, into the cell. So what will the cell then look like if more fluid begins to flow into it? Well, it'll start to swell up like a big balloon, and eventually, if it continues, it will burst. So now let's see what happens when you take the same normal plant cell, 30% particles inside of it or solute, same thing, and therefore 70% fluid or solution. And we're going to place that plant cell into a beaker that has lots of particles in it. It's hypertonic. Okay, it has 40% particles or solute, and therefore it has 60% fluid or solution. So, again, we look to see which one has more fluid. Okay, because as we know, fluid flows downhill. So, in this case, fluid flows downhill. That's right. So in this case, the plant has more fluid. So the fluid will be flowing from where into what? Or from what into what? The fluid in this case will be flowing from the cell into the solution. And when that's the case, we get a cell that begins to lose so much of its fluid that it shrinks up like a tiny little sunken, shriveled shell of its former self. And that's what happens in a hypertonic solution. happens when we take the same normal cell. It has 30% particles or solute and 70% water or fluid or solution. Okay? And again, we're going to put it into a beaker. And that beaker has the exact same amount of particles, 30% particles or solute and 70% fluid or solution. Okay, so like always, we see which one has more fluid. Well, in this case, both of them have the exact same amount of fluid. So will any of the fluid be flowing downhill? It's an interesting question. Will the fluid flow from one thing into the other thing? Will it flow from the cell into the beaker or the beaker into the cell? Because the amount of fluid is equal. That's why it's called isotonic, iso meaning equal. Well, what happens is, if you place this plant cell into this beaker, because it is isotonic, absolutely nothing happens. The fluid flows nowhere. And that is because the fluid levels are equal both inside the cell and outside the cell. And that's what happens in an isotonic situation.